That's all you have to do. Senator Singh.
Thank you. Look, I concur with the remarks there made by Senator Ludwig, particularly in relation to raising issues regarding transparency, because that is why Labor has been calling for so long for action by this government to bring legislation like this to the parliament so that we can have more transparency and this government can stop hiding the big end of town away from tax payments, but more broadly, this issue of tax avoidance. Now, why has Labor been doing this, and why are we here today at this point? Well, we're here because we live very much in a globalised world, a digitised world, a world where our economy is constantly changing, where multinational companies can move their profits from country to country, and in result of that, avoid their fair share of paying tax. Now, Labor has been calling for more action on multinational tax for over 2 years now. It was, I think, about 6 months, maybe even longer than 6 months ago, that we actually laid out our own package, a package of $7.2 billion to close these tax loopholes that we are debating here today. Tax loopholes and, to keep revenue here in Australia, which you would think, the government would think, is a good thing. So now that we're going into the detail of this bill, I think that it would be helpful that the government makes it clear that they are going to pursue this kind of tax reform under a principle of transparency, and accountability of those companies, those large multinational companies, so that they start paying their fair share of tax. And so Australian small businesses and individuals are not left up picking up the slack, because that's been the reality up until now. Why should it be that Australian small businesses, of which there are an absolute plethora, and individuals end up picking up the slack, whilst these large multinational companies that are making massive profits get away with tax avoidance? So I would like to know, as Senator Ludwig referred to how the government is going to tighten Australia's tax net in this regard in relation to the transparency principle, because that is the most important thing here, I think, over and above, obviously, this legislation passing and multinational companies paying their fair share of tax, and tackling this issue of profit shifting, which I'm really pleased that we're actually now have got to a point of doing after a couple of years or more that it's taken to get to this point. I would like to know in some detail how that transparency principle is going to be part of the government's agenda, its approach as it goes forward in looking at dealing with this issue and this kind of reform. I think my understanding is that there are something like 3 of the 5 biggest companies in the world are companies that make their money primarily on the basis of intellectual property. So if that is the case, and of course I would imagine that could be the case because we are living very much more in a digitised world economy, so you could look at those issues of being part of that. Whether there is any focus by this government on those particular multinationals, because we are talking about intellectual property being an important component of our, obviously, Australian economy, and of, again, the rights of smaller businesses and the like. I think that, again, this goes into the heart of the issue of transparency. It just also shows, though, the complexities when you're talking about multinational companies, how they can manage to do what they do, how they have managed to profit shift after all of these years. Now, I'm no expert when it comes to the tax avoidance workings of multinational companies, but I am aware that these issues have been looked at in other countries to great detail, and the UK is a good example of that. That Australia is not immune to multinationals behaving in this way in this country. It is happening, of course, right across the globe, because that's the nature of a globalised economy, and that's the nature of these particular large companies, the way that they make their profits, unfortunately, and we all bear the brunt. We miss out in the process of that. So, as I said, without that greater transparency, we will never know whether these major companies, these major corporations are paying their fair share of tax. We know that at this time the government is, started this whole new debate in relation to raising the GST and looking at, particularly everyday Australians, individuals, including low-income Australians in that, because it is a regressive tax that affects everybody. Why is it doing that? Well, it's looking at, whether all taxpayers are making their fair share contribution. Well, you can't kind of raise that argument of, let's look at our tax base and our tax system and whether Australians are paying their fair share contribution, and at the same time allow all of these large multinationals to profit shift and not make their own contribution. So this is an issue of transparency. It is a really important that transparency becomes one of the most effective tools for this government to combat the profit shifting and the tax avoidance of these multinationals. So it is my hope that the government shows a commitment to ensuring that these major corporations obviously pay their fair share of tax, but also that they need to push transparency laws in this country, that this government does not gut our tax transparency laws, but instead stands by them in the interests not just of good governance, but that would be a start, but actually in the interests of all Australians who would benefit from knowing exactly what is going on with the tax avoidance of large multinationals, which they certainly wouldn't know at this point in time. So if the minister can outline, particularly as Senator Ludwig had already alluded to, how it is not going to continue to hide the big end of town, but instead how it is going to stand by a principle of transparency when it comes to this issue of multinational tax avoidance.